Good afternoon. Welcome to this book event here at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill. My name is Daniel Béland, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at MISC to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today in the attendance to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada is known as MISC, and it's the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. And this is what we'll do today. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as our book event. And of course, these events are on a really wide range of topics that are important to Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and also from people outside around the world. So if you want more information about our institute, you can go to mcgill.ca/MISC, M-I-S-C. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce a colleague and a friend who is a professor in the Department of Political Science, just like me, and also he's the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill, Professor Khalid Medani. Khalid, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always, very difficult to follow in my friend Professor, and he's a force of nature, and I really appreciate being invited. I think all of you probably have figured that out by now. My name is Khalid Mustafa Medani, and oftentimes I go by Khalid Medani. But having read that book and the title of our distinguished guest, I've decided to go by my correct name. So don't call me Khalid, call me Khalid, please. So you've already inspired me. I'm really honored to be part and parcel of this event, and when Daniel, I'll use his first name, asked me to represent the Institute of Islamic Studies and to co-sponsor this event, I was extremely excited for a number of reasons. One of them is, of course, that at the Institute of Islamic Studies, where I'm the director, we're always keen in collaborating across units and across communities. Another is that we share very much the same vision of MISC that I never told Daniel before until this moment. And that is that for those of you not familiar with the Institute of Islamic Studies, it was founded by Professor William Cantwell Smith as early as 1952. It was the first institute of its kind in the continent of North America. And it remains one of the kind of central pillars, I would like to think, of multiculturalism in not only McGill, but Montreal and Quebec. The founding vision of Cantwell Smith of the Institute of Islamic Studies was that, number one, it was key to understand the religion of Islam, without which you could not understand Muslim societies, whether they be in Muslim majority countries or in Canada and in the United States, for example. But he also wanted an institute, a forum, where non-Muslims would be able to interact with Muslims. That was a key foundational principle of Cantwell Smith, and through over 70 years, we like to think that we've maintained that legacy, just as MISC, of course. They're much younger than us, I think, but they're trying. They're doing a good job. So I wanted to really emphasize that, and this is one of the central reasons that, of course, we're so proud and honored to be part and parcel of this event. But I wanted, first of all, to represent and acknowledge the faculty and the students. in the Institute of Islamic Studies, and particularly our staff, Shema Hassan, Adina Segarto. They're not here, but they did, along with Mary Chin, of course, from MISC, did a great deal of all of the organizing, and we appreciate that. I'd like to talk a lot, as you can tell, but I'm not going to do that because we're here and eager to, of course, listen to the discussion with Daniel and our friend and guest Haroon. So I'm going to keep it short. Many of you know of Haroon Siddiqui or of his work. He is the editorial page editor, emeritus, and former columnist for the Toronto Star, and a senior fellow at Massey College, University of Toronto. From 2016 to 2019, he was a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University, since renamed Toronto Metropolitan University. Earlier, he was a managing editor of the Brandon Sun in Manitoba. He covered or supervised coverage of Canada for 50 years under 9 prime ministers and has also reported from 50 nations. Haroon is here today to discuss with Daniel Béland and with all of you his memoir, My Name is Not Harry, in which he shares remarkable journalistic forays into the corridors of power, war zones, and cultural minefields. He also takes the reader along his personal journey from British colonial India to the evolution of Muslims as well as multiculturalism in Canada. His native and adopted lands serve as metaphors for what can go wrong and what can be made right. So I know you'll welcome Mr. Haroon Siddiqui to McGill. Give him that warm McGill welcome if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introductions, and thank you for taking the time to come here to Montreal for this event. And I think we have to start by the title. Obviously, this is a great title, and there is a story behind it. And I think my name is not Harry. Obviously, your name is Haroon, your given name. So why this title? What does it mean?
I first want to thank you and Khaled for organizing this. Thank you all for coming. You see, you can see he has a booming radio voice. It's impossible to follow him. The title comes from, it's a mischievous title, an assertion of personal identity, a plea for people to really stretch their muscles and pronounce people's names properly. It used to be that in any majority culture, they tend to mistreat minorities, and the first way of violating their dignity without realizing it is to either change their names or mispronounce their names. You remember this great scene from The Godfather where the boatloads of Italians are coming on Ellis Island, and they're all miserable-looking characters lined up to the immigration officer, and one guy comes and the immigration officer says, "What is your name?" And he said, "Giovanni Vinci." "Okay, you're John." Done. For the rest of his life, he was John. The particular title comes from, I used to live in Manitoba at one time, and occasionally from Brandon, I used to go to the legislature, where a premier had taken over in the 1970s. His name was Sterling Lyon, a brilliant conservative, traditionalist, who used to call me Harry. And I told him, that's not my name. And the second time, or I forget the third time, he said the same thing. I said, "Premier, my name is not Harry. I don't look like Harry. I don't want to be Harry. This is my name." And Adrian Clarkson, the former governor general, who happens to be a friend in Toronto, said, "That is the title of your book." I said, "What do you mean this is the title of your book?" He said, "That is the title of your book." So this title is ode to two very disparate Canadians, one right-winger from Manitoba and one left-winger from Toronto, which is a very Canadian thing. That's how it came about.
That's where it comes from, and you tell the story in the book. Now, the book is available for sale. I will say it before I forget. Outside, so after that, we'll have a reception after the discussion and the Q&A, and you have copies of the book that are available for sale, and it's a really highly readable and entertaining read with a lot of insight, but also a lot of content, of really diverse content. Now, let's start by the story of, since this is the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, let's start at because the beginning of the book, you talk about your upbringing in India and your early work there and so forth. But let's start by, you know, what happened to you in 1967, right? Towards the end of the Expo 67, right? You actually landed here. Then you moved on further west, right?
Yes, yes.
Toronto, and then even further west, Brandon, Manitoba.
Of all places, yes.
Yeah, of all places, exactly. But what struck you when you arrived here in Montreal and in Canada more generally, as an immigrant from India?
There's a bit of a background to that. I had never heard of Canada in India until I was a junior reporter in Bombay, which has since been renamed Mumbai. And the Canadian High Commissioner, Roland Michener, who went on to become a very successful Governor General of Canada, at one of those trade events as a junior reporter, you go and in the small talk at the reception, he said something like, young men like you should go to Canada. And I said, why would anyone want to go to Canada? It's so cold there, isn't it? And that was the end of the conversation, but the idea stuck. I think that was 1963. 1965, I applied and immediately got accepted because the standards were very low at that time for entrance to Canada. But then I did not exercise it. In 66, a letter came from the Canadian High Commission saying, your time is running out, buddy. You know, are you going to go or not? And I sought an extension, and in 67, I did land in Montreal. It was an extraordinary event, Expo 67. Those of you who are old enough to remember it, extraordinary sort of a sense of positiveness. People from all over the world were here. My aunt is here, and her husband was involved in Expo 67. And it was nothing but positive. Anyway, I went from here to Toronto and arrived there on a Saturday, went on Monday to the Globe and Mail looking for a job. And the legendary managing editor, Clark Davies, said, no job for you. So I said, what do you mean no job for me? He said, no Canadian experience. So I said, I have portable qualities. I was a journalist working part-time for the BBC. And he said, no. I had hired two people from India and they had atrocious English. So in my youthful impertinence, I said, Mr. Davy, you're going to penalize me for your mistake in hiring the wrong people. I said, you may think so, but no job for you. So anyway, so I got a job at selling clothing in the basement of Simpson's men's department. I was one of the best dressed people around. That was one of the benefits of it. Anyway.
You're still well dressed.
No, thank you. 8 months later, I ended up in Brandon, Manitoba. But the real crisis was the following, which nobody expects. When we came here, we Indians especially, we found no yogurt. There was no yogurt in Canada. So we went around asking, where can one find yogurt? How can an Indian cannot be without yogurt? He cooks in it, he eats it, and so on. So they said, no, there's something called sour cream. But sour cream was like a blob that bloated your tummy, you know. Not only that, there was no lamb, no goat, only beef that I did not grow up consuming. Very few fruit, very few vegetables, very few spices. No guava, no mango, no papaya. No brinjal, no okra, no gourd. No coriander, no cloves, no cumin, no cardamom, and no saffron. For saffron, they said, if you go to a Ukrainian neighborhood, you might find it during Easter because they use it in their baking. So when I was talking to my mother in India, Amma said, "Kahan chale gaye ho? What sort of place have you gone to?" They said, "It has no yogurt." So I explained all this thing, and she said, "You better come back home, son." So I'm glad I stayed. So that was the biggest challenge. The punchline is the following. When I was in Brandon, Indians used to bemoan this fact of no yogurt. And one of the persons in Brandon was an Indian immigrant, Kala Gopinath, who had gone home to Mangalore, and she smuggled some culture back on the plane without informing the customs people. And she brought it carefully and he mixed it with milk, put it in a warm place overnight, lo and behold, the next day the yogurt was there. And then she distributed samples to all of us, so we were all set for yogurt. That's how yogurt came to Canada.
What's interesting too, you see how yogurt came to Canada, but all the ingredients that you mentioned, the produce that you mentioned, now they are widely available in Canada,
Yes.
partly because of immigration and immigrants bringing also their taste and their culinary taste to the country, that the food supply in Canada is much more diverse, what you can buy in a grocery store now than it was in 1967, right?
In fact, Canada has become the cuisine capital of the world. I mean, this is 50 years out, and we are a change country. That's the power of demographics. I mean, it's a simple thing about yogurt, and we laugh about it, but it's symbolic of what has happened to the country. You know, what people bring besides their cultures and so on, they bring their cuisine. Mm-hmm. And Canada is a different country, and Canada has changed for the better in the last 50 or 60 years. I don't know of any country, certainly in the Western world or anywhere else, that has changed so dramatically, so immensely, culturally, socially, politically, and in majority-minority relations as has Canada, and done so peacefully.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely the case. So let's talk about immigration, because that's what we are talking about already.
Please.
In general, it's a hot topic in Canada. It's often a hot topic, but right now we are talking about specific issues. We saw on Monday this cap on foreign students, the debate about temporary foreign workers, and also even about asylum seekers. So there are a lot of things on the agenda right now dealing with immigration. Based on your experience, not only as someone who came to Canada as an immigrant, but also someone who wrote a lot about this issue over the years, what's your take on the current situation of Canada in terms of our immigration policies, based on the fact that immigration is so essential to Canada today, and it's been essential for a very long time, but what do you think what are the challenges we face in terms of our immigration policies today?
Yeah, you see, the change in immigration and immigration policy has been very profound in this country. Two things have happened. First, just to back up. From a presumed Christian and white country, we have now become, the reality is accepted that we are a majority Christian and majority white country. And there's a great distinction between the two. That's one. Number two is there's a national consensus around immigration for the simple reason that there's a broad demographic fact of life which many Europeans have still yet to come to terms with. All the Western societies, and especially in Europe, are aging societies. So who will pay for your Medicare is the issue. You need a certain bulge of working age group of people between 25 and 45, 50 to keep paying taxes and sustain the social and medical services we need. Canada and Europe do not have those kinds of people. The only immigrants available in the world are from Asia and from the South, which means brown people and black people. This assumption that immigrants will always be white was an assumption before. That assumption is not only gone, but it is not possible at this point. That is the reality. But Canada has now generally, Canada is the only OECD country in the world at this point that has had and continues to have, and I'll come to the reservations in a second, a national consensus on immigration. This is an extraordinary development that we Canadians, in our own modesty, take it for granted. Because what is the biggest fault line in the Western world today? There's populism and there's Trumpism and there is this and there is that. The biggest fault line is the color line. In the United States, Mexican border, all those brownies are coming. In Europe, same thing, the Muslims are taking over, or the blacks are taking over, and refugees are taking over. That is the major fault line across the West. In Canada, that is not the fault line. So when we say there's a national consensus on immigration, automatically it says there's a consensus on a majority of the people coming in will be non-white. This is the only country that has that consensus. Now, back to your question. There is new tensions. You can see in the polls, the needle is moving. Why? Because there's housing prices are up. There is no funds available for cities in Montreal, Toronto, everywhere is the same thing. There's no funding available. Immigration and student visas and so on mismanaged because we have a bulge in student visas, badly misused by certain colleges and so on, including government-funded community colleges and so on, who have been charging unconscionable fees to these people who can barely afford it because that has been their ticket to increasing their revenue. So we are talking from both sides of our mouth. On the one hand, say we are getting too many people. On the other hand, colleges want these people because they are making money off them. It's unconscionable. But nonetheless, these concerns that are being expressed have not yet deteriorated into xenophobia, have not yet deteriorated into racism of any kind, which in the United States, it's openly so. In Great Britain, it's openly so. Here is the so-called smaller liberal-minded conservative Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, of Indian origin, a consultant at that, non-ideological. He is proposing to send people back to Rwanda, for example. We don't have that debate in Canada. So while we whine, we should remind ourselves that we have done something well, and it follows from there that it behooves us and the government of the day to keep this consensus while addressing the issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you. You talk about racism, about the fact that the situation in Canada is different than what you see in other countries, but something that we share with other countries, especially Western countries, that's something you talk about in your book in several chapters, and something that you experienced personally is the rise of Islamophobia, especially after the events of September 11, 2001. But it started before that. It's not something new or that recent, but still we saw a surge or an explosion even of that. And it's something that you wrote about, and you receive also a lot of attacks for some of your positions on this when you were, writing in the Toronto Star and so forth. So, and this is something you reflect on in your book. So, you tell the story very well of this rise of Islamophobia and how you experience it as well. But how can we fight Islamophobia? And also, how can we fight other forms of hatred? And in your book, you also compare Islamophobia with anti-Semitism. And you say these two are quite similar in their structure, right? They have a lot in common. So how do we fight Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hatred in our society here in Canada?
Yeah, you see, as a prelude to answering your question, I personally have never faced racism in this country. I have no sob stories to tell, which does not mean that there is no racism. There's plenty, obviously, as our indigenous people will testify. I was talking to Mort here, my dear friend, Professor Weinfeld from McGill University. He said, very few of my students will agree with your optimistic outlook about Canada because they think of us as a very racist state. Racism is rampant. And no question, racism has not gone. And it is the function of every young generation to challenge us all the time. They're passionate about it. And they are finding their voice. Under multiculturalism, what has happened is that people have found their voice, all the suppressed voices who presume that you do in Rome as the Romans do, which was a way of setting up a pecking order. You will stay low on the lowest of the rung and you make your way up because I did the same 50 years ago. That no longer applies to the extent that it did before. So young people are passionate. They want equality and they don't want excuses anymore. So back to your specific question. Islamophobia has always been present. It dates back to the Crusades. To crunch the history, I mean, there was the prospect of the Islamic bomb, for example, when Pakistan was making it. We had never heard of a Christian bomb, or a Jewish bomb, or a Hindu bomb, or a Buddhist bomb, but Muslim, Islamic bomb. I mean, that shows you the extent of the racism, acceptable kind of prejudice, acceptable kind of racism. Mainstream media seriously writing about the Islamic bomb, I mean, and nobody would blink an eye at that. So, but 9/11 brought this out into the open. And what really happened right after 9/11, I, who happened to be a Canadian journalist who happened to be Muslim, I was deemed a Muslim journalist overnight. What do you, Siddiqui, have to say about this? So I was personally responsible for what was happening in the world, terrorism and so on. The 19 terrorists who killed 3,000 innocent Americans on 9/11 were Muslims. But it did not follow that all Muslims were terrorists. And the counter-argument was, but all the terrorists these days are Muslim. Or maybe so, but at one time they were Jewish, they were Hindus, they were this and they were that, you know. But two things happened at that time, and I tell this story often because it sort of gives an insight into Canada. The first column I wrote after that was, of course, in solidarity with the Americans, our friends and neighbors. The third column I wrote was entitled, "It's the American Foreign Policy, Stupid." And the establishment came tumbling down on my head at that. How can you say that? Even if you could say that, this is the worst time to say it. My response was, this is the best time to say it. And even some of my bosses were very upset about it. Lo and behold, within about 72 hours, I had 650 or 750 emails and written responses and telephone calls. An overwhelming majority of Canadians said, thank you for saying it. So here, something is going on here. The establishment, all the newspapers in Canada, all the political establishment, everyone was, keep your mouth shut, don't say anything, just express solidarity with the United States, that's it, and line up to fight the war on terror. Of course you should, but when I see this mailbox here, there's something going on here. So the establishment is on one side, the majority of Canadians were on the other. Something else happened. In the next few weeks, something emerged that there was a virulent minority who became very anti-Muslim. So majority, public opinion could see the reality, establishment was on the other side, but a tiny minority of them were very pro-American, were very patriotic for United States, and they became very virulently anti-Muslim. And that just went on and on. For the last 15 or 20 years, we have seen various manifestations of it. And that, two things, then I'll just shut up. When you wage wars, wars are waged not only on the ground, but they're waged in home countries as well, because there's a propaganda war that goes with it, because you want to keep public opinion on side. So the war was launched on Afghanistan, the war on terror, launched a war on a people that had nothing to do with 9/11. Afghanistan simply happened to be the postal address of Osama bin Laden. You could have landed a bomb on his head and be done with it if that is what you wanted. But we couldn't even do that because, remember, Bill Clinton had tried to launch cruise missiles and ended up killing a few goats and nothing else. So they couldn't even do that right. But the propaganda was unleashed was the following. Cherie Blair and Laura Bush went into action and said, we are in Afghanistan to liberate Afghan women. Afghan women may and do indeed need liberating, but we did not invade Afghanistan to liberate Afghan women, which is BS. Wars need propaganda. Come 2003, Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction, which nobody could find. The United Nations people could not find, but weapons of mass destruction. There was a prime minister at that time who had a backbone, Mr. Jean Chrétien, who said, we will not join until the United Nations finds the weapons of mass destruction, and we need United Nations approval. It was a Saturday, I was at home, a call came from the Prime Minister's office and said, the Prime Minister wants to talk to you. So what do you say, I'm busy, or no? You say, yes, of course, yes, sir. And he said, I am going to the White House on Monday to talk to Mr. Bush. What do you want to, what should I tell him about the Iraq War? So I said, Prime Minister, far be it from me to tell the Prime Minister of the day as to what he should tell the President of the United States. But if your question, sir, is what am I hearing? The answer is overwhelming opposition to this war in Canada. And you know what his response was? Yes, yes, that's what I hear, especially from new Canadians and new immigrants. His antenna was up. The changed Canada, the new immigrants, the demography of Canada has changed so much because they bring a separate, different internationalistic outlook than the old Canadian outlook of obedience to either London or obedience to Washington. They can think for themselves. And that is one of the things that we talk about demographic change. Demography has changed and our way of looking at things has changed. And the Gaza war is proving that at this time. Establishment is on one side, media is on one side, the public sentiment seems to be completely on the other side. So there is this dynamic change that is taking place. Sorry, we can come back to it. So back to your question. Islamophobia then took on a different form, a kind of cultural warfare on Islam and Muslims, which was totally distorting, had nothing to do with reality. Sharia is coming. Sharia is coming. I mean, how will Sharia come, for God's sake? Will we set aside the criminal code? Will we pass laws in Canada and the United States and Europe that we will chop off the hands of thieves tomorrow morning? What is this nonsense? But kind of hysteria takes over, And this hysteria was evident in Canada as well. That's one. Not only that, it distorts your thinking in a million other ways. If we were in Afghanistan to liberate Afghan women, and if we have presumed that Afghan men are or may be misogynistic, and Arabs may be misogynistic, and we need to save them, Muslims here may be misogynistic as well, and we need to save Muslim women in Canada. Therefore, in Europe, bans on hijab. In Quebec, ban on hijab, and so on and so forth. So what we have is this anomaly, this paradox, which is extraordinary and people don't pay attention to it. The Taliban and the Ayatollahs and the mullahs tell women what to wear. Liberals and secularists in Europe and Canada, especially in Quebec, tell women what not to wear. The impulse to control women's bodies is the same from different angles. All we are left to do is to argue about the penalties. Here we want to fire them from the jobs, from the public service. So we fire them from the jobs that they hold, and that will make them lose their independence from their husbands and fathers and brothers and so on and so on, ostensibly in the name of liberating them or saving them. This is insanity. So this is a way of answering your question in a roundabout way. 9/11 has distorted our perceptions and our own common sense and our own liberal secular values. And I have not taken a position one way or the other about the hijab. But there's no logic to it left. So that's how we get distorted. So the war on terror and so on not only spent $8 trillion and achieved nothing and had to leave Afghanistan and left Iraq in a mess, and distorted our own democracies in ways that we are still counting. Sorry, the long answer.
No.
That's what it is.
Yes. So let's talk about let's talk about Canada more generally and where we are going. And I was pleased when I reached towards the end of your book, actually the very last chapter, that you quoted my predecessor, professor, historian, late historian Des Morton. Yes. And this is a quote that I will read loud there, and I will ask you to comment on it. So that's his quote. We started out as a country for the white trash of Europe, but look where we have ended up. People from all over the world want to come here. We have a lot that works, and what doesn't can be fixed, unlike in many other places. End of quote. So in your view, what is the most important thing that we need to fix in this country, that we can fix and should fix?
Oh, I mean, the first duty of any prime minister is to keep national unity intact. That's one.
And And do you feel national unity is really facing a direct threat right now?
No, you see, we managed it. I mean, what has happened in Quebec since we are here is that the threat of separatism is receded. One can argue that it has receded at the expense of Quebec nationalism, for which minorities are paying the price in Quebec. But that's an equation one can argue about. Settle with our indigenous peoples, the shameful record that we have, the cultural genocide that we committed on them. And third, we need to keep this national consensus on pluralism. You ask Canadians, what is the number one quality about Canada that you like? The number one thing they state is pluralism and multiculturalism. 85%. More than hockey, more than the beaver, more than other things that traditional symbols of our unity. That's a very important, that is the unique, that's what I said earlier, makes Canada unique. We need to preserve that sentiment, and you have to all work at it all the time. And you know, we spoke about indigenous peoples. This all that I have said about multiculturalism in Canada, it is not an accident. It's a part of our history that we don't appreciate. You know, John Ralston Saul, the great philosopher, End of Globalism and all the books. One of his better books was A Fair Country, 2007 or so. In that, he argued that Canada is a Métis nation. Canada is shaped by our indigenousness, even if we are not indigenous. And the argument was the following. The indigenous people have this idea of the circle, and they kept expanding the circle to include the people who came in. They taught the white man how to survive the winter. It's later that we turned against them and committed the cultural genocide and residential schools and all the other horrors. But that sensibility was reflected in the British North America Act. How so? Because the DNA Act recognized three collectivities: French and the English and the Aboriginal people, as they were called at that time. The great American historian, what's his name, Fukuyama, said this famously, that there's a big hole at the heart of the American Constitution. It does not recognize collective rights. Everything is individual rights, happiness. Canada is different: peace, order, and good government, and balance being individual rights and collective rights. That in turn leads to the B&B Commission. Those of you old enough to remember, in the 1960s and early 70s, a biculturalism bilingual commission in Canada that held hearings across the country. And by the time it came from the Maritimes to Ontario and Quebec and it hit the prairies, it ran into a storm of anger. People said, oh, bilingualism, we understand. What is this biculturalism business? We are all multicultural. We are Icelandic, and we are Poles, and we are Ukrainians, and we are this, and we are that. Following which B&B Commission recommended multiculturalism. That's how multiculturalism came about. Pierre Trudeau getting up in Parliament in 1971 saying, Canada has no official culture. There is no one way to be Canadian. So long as you obey the law, and of course pay your taxes. That's a very Canadian thing to do. You must pay your taxes. You remember Peter Zawski, who used to do the CBC radio show? He used to have fun competitions. And one of the competitions was, please complete the following sentence. As Canadian as, ... The winning entry came from a high school student. And it said, as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. That was the winning entry. But in that ambiguity is a greater truth about Canada. You see, that you don't have, so long as you obey the law and you pay your taxes, you can be as Canadian as you want. And people come to their Canadianness in their own way, in their own time. And this is the only country where there's an 85% uptake on citizenship from immigrants who come to this country. Not in other lands, even where it is possible. So we have something special here, despite all the problems we have. So when Desmond Morton spoke about this greater truth, every generation feels the need to remake the country. for the better, and does all the time. So this country allows you to do it is a slap in the face of those who used to, better not change my country. And of course, only a fascist culture is a fixed culture. Every living, breathing culture evolves every day, and that's what the greatness of Canada is.
Thank you very much. This is uplifting, and it's also a good transition for the Q&A with the people here in the room. You know, you have a microphone close or in front of you, right? I will actually move it a bit away, but so if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. But then, in order to speak, you will have to push on the button, and then you will have a red light, and you will be able to speak, because this is being recorded and live streamed. So raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, so we'll start here, and then after that, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your tremendous honesty in your discussion of the books. Lest we forget that before this 9/11 incident, there was a madman who commandeered a 747 from Heathrow to Nairobi. It was in 2000. And he pitched that 747 up to 42,000 feet and used the drag forces to bring him to die. It's almost as if those 350 lives were not relevant. Nobody locked the doors afterwards. When you think about the fact that the International Credit and Commerce Bank was funded with the help of the CIA. I don't want to speak about these, but I thank you for your honesty, because what happened then seems to be reproducing itself in today's conflict. So indeed, it is indeed American foreign policy that is very, very stupid. My question has more to do with translations. I'm referring to a book from contemporary Irish literature written by Brian Friel called Translations. They show that the first step towards erasing people's culture was changing the names, not only people's given names and their family names, but also, actually family names were retained, but the names of the streets and the places and the history, and then taking their language away from them. And we see that happens with indigenous cultures as well. I'd like to know your opinion on how that melds with the vision that you've presented in the book, and how the erasure of these identities ultimately is the worst form of genocide. It's cultural genocide. It's the way to belittle a people. And moreover, how this sets the stage for the types of conflicts that our cultures confront today. Thank you.
Thank you. There are various questions in that, but if the question is about changing street names as it's happening in Toronto, Dundas Street is being changed, this name of Dundas Square is being changed because he was part of slavery, Ryerson University has been renamed, and so on and so forth. I find myself with the old concept of Pierre-Éliott Trudeau. You cannot change history, you can only learn from it. So, so you change the name of Dundas Street at the cost of $7 million, whereas you don't have the money to fix potholes. It gets people's dander up. You lose that national consensus or city consensus that you need to operate. And there's a kind of arrogance to this, that comes either of youth or of whatever, or activism of some kind. I heard a new phrase today. It'll come to me. Payam Akhawan, I was talking to him this morning, and he told me a new phrase. I'll come back to it and I'll tell you. It's a kind of feel-good policy, You change names. So you have changed the name. Have you changed history? Was Ryerson's crimes, whatever they were, are they fixed? I'm not all for changing these names, and so we learn from them. That is a better approach in my books. Sorry.
No, thank you. We have more questions. Just yes.
Okay. My name is Rupin or Rupinder. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill here with the Department of Political Science. This was a fantastic talk. I study South Asian voter behavior, primarily Sikh voting behavior, and this is right up my alley. I had two questions for you, just purely interest-wise. The first one, you'd mentioned that Canada has not yet deteriorated into racism and xenophobia. Are you talking about explicit racism primarily or implicit racism, and could you speak more to that? And then my secondary question is, what are your insights to intra-racial discrimination that's happening in Canada? Sorry, there's feedback. So how do we deal with Islamophobia that's rampant within brown communities in Canada? How do we fix this good immigrant, bad immigrant mentality that's been kind of building since since increasing immigration trends since, I would say, the 1970s and 80s?
Right. You see, there was a great Canadian historian, Irving Abella, who said, Canada is a nation of immigrants that hates immigrants. And then there's Senator Ratna Umidwar from Toronto, who says, Canada wants immigration without immigrants. How is this possible, you know? So this is a national sport. This is just static that one should ignore, that's one. Because if you just look at the overall big picture and so on, and I made it absolutely clear that racism is not gone. There's examples galore, everyone has their own favorites. I mean, Ukraine conflict is taking place, 185,000 refugees have come, or people have been allowed to come. There are a million conflicts in the world. What about the Uyghurs, and what about the so-and-so, and what about the so-and-so, what about the people of Gaza? Why are we not opening our doors to them? So, security. I mean, Mr. Harper had said in 2015 election, we cannot have Syrian refugees, they may be all terrorists and so on. Since then we have had 70,000 Syrian refugees, and we have not had terrorist incidents from Syrians at least. So this is politics that goes on. You talked about democracy just one. 2015 election, Mr. Harper, unfortunately, was the only prime minister that I know of in contemporary Canada that openly discriminated against one group of people based on their faith. Openly hostile anti-Muslim policies in the name of fighting jihadism. Anyway, upside. 2015 election rolls around, and he comes up with this stupid idea of barbaric cultural act. And that was one straw too many for all Canadians. And Mr. Harper got thrown out. That's one. Number two, in that election, the national turnout was 72%, if I am not mistaken. In 9 Toronto ridings with significant Muslim population, the turnout was 87%. And they voted 2% or 5% for the Conservatives and 65% overwhelmingly for the Liberals. This is not a pitch for Liberals, but this is a way of saying how people, citizens can mobilize. And all those 9 ridings, the Harperites got totally turfed out. So democracy prevails in the end when people participate, and that is our job as citizens, to participate, to help change and bring Canadian public opinion on your side. And a lot of Canadians realize that Mr. Harper was being bigoted, and he lost election for many reasons, but that was one of the main reasons, you know. And the last point to be made is, especially to young people, is democracy moves ever so slowly. You know, it tests your patience all the time. I used to have a publisher, Béland Hondrick, old style person, and he was very tough to work for. And he would run in, why aren't you writing about this issue, in his nasal voice? So I said, Béland, we just wrote an editorial 5 days ago. You have to keep repeating it in a democracy to build public opinion. So it takes time. On balance, you're doing all right. Yes. Next. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I also immigrated from India in the late 60s, but as a baby.
Where did you come? Where did you
from
come?
Mumbai. From
Where?
Mumbai.
Mumbai. You're a Mumbai wala.
Yes.
I worked in Mumbai.
So I'm also very proud about many things in Canada, and I also like to poke my American friends. And of course, many of them, like many Americans, very educated Americans, have no clue about the rest of the world. But some of them do. And one of the things that several people have said to me is, you Canadians have a far more racist or certainly class-based immigration policy by our point system than the U.S. does. So I was just wondering since you've talked a lot about immigration, about the Canadian point system.
Yeah, you see, that is an argument, and used to be that even further back. Canada is saved by the seas, kind of an argument, You don't have a third world country right next door to you, so you're protected by the sea and by your geography. That's one argument. Second argument is that you go and select people by the point system, so you deprive the third world of their best talent, you bring them here. You remember in the 80s there used to be a slogan saying, every time you select a doctor from India, please send a check for $1 million back to India, because that's how much you have spent training him. Sure, that's an argument. But what has happened is it's leveled out now. For the last 15, 20 years, number one source of immigration was China. Number one or number two source of immigration, India. Number one or two source of immigration, Philippines. So that argument is sort of outdated now. I think it's been turned on its head. Wherever I turn, they're all Indians and Chinese people taking over. All the jobs are being done by them. And I tell this story. I'd come back from a holiday somewhere in COVID time, and they say, line up again for one more COVID test at the airport. Exhausted. So, one more COVID test. I've just come back from. Anyway. So, and you must fill out this form. And you must fill out this form in an app, in a telephone. I'm old. I'm 80 years old. I don't know how to do these things. So I turned to one of the people who was the young person who was there, and she said, sir, give it to me. And she said, and I said, it's asking for your home address in India. Home address in India? Who knows? India addresses are notoriously infamous for whatever word, /so A-BC. So I said, I don't remember it. So I said, sir, this is only a computer. It doesn't know. Just say ABCD. Or put 1239. It'll be all right. And she put some number in and it was fine. So here was this girl who was maybe 21, whip smart, computer literate from India. And imagine her sense of some properly brought up Canadian would have said, no, that is wrong. You cannot write like that. Put exact address. So this is street smart talking, you see. So people from, diversion. People from India make great immigrants. There are 30 million immigrants all over the world. Fiji, Australia, Caribbean, South Africa, East Africa, and so on. And they have since made secondary immigration, migrated to Canada. I was going in a plane once, Turkish airline, which had just started the service, and I look out in the aircraft, and all full of Indians, Sikhs, and so on. So I asked the crew, I said, are you flying to India these days? So he said, no, sir, we take them to Istanbul, from there they go to India. And haven't you heard this? Well, what? In aviation circles, we say no plane takes off anywhere in the world without an Indian on board. So they're always traveling. Sorry, this is a deviation. Go ahead.
So, yes.
There was one more hand somewhere.
Yes, there's one here.
Yes, please. Go
Hi.
ahead.
I'm a PhD candidate at McGill.
Yes.
I'm from India, Kerala. Over the last 60 years, do you think the media space has been pluralized in terms of how far they have been accommodating immigrants and people from diasporic backgrounds being part of the media? Because I've been here for the last 5-6 years. I often see, especially print media and as well as digital media, largely white people discussing about what's happening in Canada. For example, when it comes to housing crisis, when it comes to other sort of crisis, I don't see like any immigrant voices, sharing their own experience regarding these issues.
Brilliant, brilliant, because this is a continuous problem with our media. Our media remain by and large white, except for some faces on television. They cover whiteness They're enveloped in whiteness. Their whole coverage is like that still up to this day. The great battles were fought in the 70s and 80s. The first thing that you noticed when you came to Canada, I noticed certainly, that the media had trouble. Further back. Media narrative was them, the uncivilized people over there, Asia, Africa, and we, the civilized people here. Them versus us. That is the format of most news coverage. Except starting in the late 60s, the them started arriving here. And our media could not distinguish between the them here and the us here, you know. They're neighbors, for God's sake. So they're covering Indians and blacks and other people and Chinese as though they're foreigners, just happen to be here next to living to me. This was a big transition. We had to do seminar after seminar through the Canadian Newspaper Association. Advertising Standards Canada may have made this much of a difference. And there were no recruitment. You see, there's an old saying, we all recruit in our likeness. So why is that Chicago Fire Department was all Irishmen? How come Irish have special talent for putting out fires? No, some Irishman came and he kept gathering his own people. So we hire in our own likeness. There was a secondary problem that from people from cultures of India, China, and so on, they think of the journalists as the people who do journalism after they've failed at everything else. It's the lowest of the low. When my father heard that I was going to do journalism, he asked whatever he asked and so on. And then you realize something, don't you? He said, no one will give their daughter to you in marriage. So why is that? Because journalists were lowest of the low. Now we are celebrities. We are now fancy. By the time, so Indians who came here, Chinese who came here, become a doctor, lawyer, engineer, journalism, no. By the time these second generation kids came along through universities and so on, jobs had dried up. There are no jobs in the media. I tell everyone, get a day job. There are no jobs in journalism. They're exploiting you. So get a day job right on the side if you wish. So what has happened, back to your question, is media narrative remains totally skewed. So it is skewed. In fact, I've made the argument, I think it's in part of the book. Our media, American media, are generally an extension of the State Department or establishment consensus on American hegemony in the world. So we end up acting as the PR department of the Pentagon or the State Department. The same thing is happening in Canada. International events take place, back to 9/11, war on terror. Every media outlet in this country, with the exception of the Toronto Star, was all gung-ho about this war. The people were against it. In Iraq war, the establishment and the media were all for it, from the front page editorials. Luckily, they did not make much difference in certain instances, but that kind of approach still remains. Our media narrative is extraordinarily problematic, remains so up to this day. No question. So how do we change it? One can take solace with saying they don't really matter. Why don't they matter? Because in the 2015 election that I keep going back to, the national, the media, Post Media Group, every major newspaper in the country, Calgary Herald, National Post, Regina Leader Post, Saskatoon Star Phoenix, Edmonton Journal, Calgary Herald, Vancouver Sun, from the front page, vote for Mr. Harper, vote Conservatives. Made no difference in there. So we can happily say they really don't make much difference. Then there is social media, and it is started out as a great sort of promising thing. It will democratize the public space. Sure, it did for a time, but since then we know it's oozing poison. That's what it's doing. Because American corporations have figured out an algorithm that prioritize hate, emotion, anger, illogic, conspiracy theories, and so on. Worse, what it has enabled people to do is to retreat into their own silos. I belong to the group that I like. I talk to people, I listen to people who agree with me. So this has undermined democracy. because the democracy operates under the notion that there is a common ground at which we meet, we hash out ideas and come to some broad consensus. So if you're all in our own silos, then 48% vote for Donald Trump. And he's the leading candidate for the Republican Party. So what is the answer? I don't know what the answer is, but we are in trouble. Sorry, long way of coming.
So we have time for one last question. Maybe there is no last question.
Wow, you are so good. Yes, go ahead.
We have one just here. All right.
Go ahead.
Last one.
I have a question. Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I'm Kale. I'm a PhD student in the political science department, working with Danielle, actually.
Is he a good prof?
He's the best.
Okay, there you go.
I think we've all recognized that here, right? Radio voice,
Yes,
force of
radio
nature.
voice.
I have a question extending from the self-reinforcing silos, and you know, when posed to the question, what are some of those key issues facing Canada? One that you listed was national unity. I'm originally from Alberta. Yesterday, our premier met with Jordan Peterson, Tucker Carlson, Conrad Black in an event, and I'm wondering how much the kind of provincialization and the kind of adoption of a particular anti-federal ideology we're seeing at those subnational levels is contributing to a disjuncture in that national unity. In my lifetime, I see it, but longer memory here that I'd like to tap into.
You see, regionalism has always been part of Canada. I mean, we forget Mr. Eberhard in the 1920s and 30s in Alberta, social credit, lived in their own world. Even Mr. Lougheed, who was tough as a conservative, he was very pro-Albertan and so on. David Peterson, during the Meech Lake Accord, if you remember, he offered 6 Ontario seats, Senate seats, as a way of reaching a consensus. He was turfed out in the next election. So regionalism has always been part of Canada. Alberta regionalism is particularly virulent at this time. Jason Kenney and so on have made a habit out of it. But you see, that is a conservative trend. Anything goes wrong, you blame the feds. That's a long-standing Canadian phenomenon. They have personalized it. It's Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau's inflation, Justin Trudeau's rain, Justin Trudeau's snow, Justin Trudeau is responsible for everything, you know, and that's what this one is doing. They're also playing in Alberta. If you go to Alberta, you listen closely. What they're saying is, in effect, what is happening in Quebec is being reflected there. If Quebec can do this, why can't we do this? If Quebec has its own pension plan, has this, why can't we do it? And the more they hear about Bill 21 and so on, if they can get away with it with the notwithstanding clause, why can't we do it? So these are sort of, what am I saying? They're sort of a balancing act that people need to be wary of. And previously, politicians used to be adversaries, but they were not enemies, you know. Okay, I disagree with Daniel, fine, but we'll go out and have dinner together. Those days are sort of gone because of social media. Our current conservative leader is a master of devising and saying those things. It's up to the people of Canada what they decide. So regionalism is a phenomenon that has always been present in Canada, but has taken a nasty turn at this time. And we as citizens have to raise our voices against it. But mostly it is the Albertans who have to raise their voice against it, you see, in Alberta. It is the Quebecers who have to raise their voice against it. So Quebec uses the notwithstanding clause. It goes to court, Bill 21. The court finds it's legal barely because they have used the notwithstanding clause. However, there is no doubt that this bill is directly meant to disproportionately affect Muslim minorities. Yesterday, it may have affected the Jewish minority. In the 1950s, it affected the Jehovah's Witness. So these are the ups and downs of democracy, and we just have to keep the big picture in mind that on balance, we are doing all right.
Thank you very much.
I was asked to make concluding remarks, and of course I didn't prepare any concluding remarks, but I wanted to listen to the discussion on multiculturalism and, of course, representing the Institute of Islamic Studies. I think that we all take Islamophobia very seriously. It's a term that's bandied about a great deal. And it seems to explain a great deal, but does not really explain very much, if you know what I mean. From the Muslim perspective, one, of course, is kind of forced to always defend Muslim communities. That's part. For some of us, it's our job. But for those who are not kind of specialists and scholars of Islamic studies, the fact that they're put in that position on a daily basis, to me, of course, is extremely troubling within the context of discussions of multiculturalism. And so I wanted to just kind of point out why Islamophobia, just like other forms of racism, always comes as a surprise, no matter how many books you read about it, no matter how many articles. But it always comes as a surprise to Muslims, as, of course, racism would come as a surprise to black citizens of Canada or Arabs and all of those different things. So I stand here in terms of Mr. Intersectionality. It depends on the day. But today I want to speak about Muslims and the Muslim community. And I think as a political scientist, we all have different kind of interests. And I want to just, if you allow me, talk about my favorite surah or chapter in the Quran. Al-Hujurat, which in Arabic means the chambers. It's the 49th surah, and it came down on the Prophet Muhammad, as we say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace and blessings be upon him. This is not going to be a sermon, by the way. There's a point to this. And that has to do with the reason that this particular surah or chapter in the Quran is the most popular and the one that we all know from childhood. It's almost like, those nursery rhymes that you learn when you're very young. And for Muslims, Surah Al-Hujurat is extremely important, resonant, and it is kind of how one conducts one's life throughout the day and in interaction with other people. Al-Hujurat sets out etiquette and norms to be observed by Muslims, which is a really important aspect of this verse. It also sets up an injunction against what we call kind of gossip or news that is absent verification. I wanted to make that point because it is an injunction against false news and gossip and incendiary kind of discourse. It also calls for peace and reconciliation, as well as injunctions against defamation. It becomes a really central aspect of the instruction of Muslims, not only in terms of norms, but how to lead their life in law. Law, of course, Sharia, as you may know in Arabic, is the way. It's not kind of codified system. It's a way of life, which becomes really important. It, of course, as most surahs do, also declares a universality, egalitarianism, and a brotherhood, of course. But this is by way of a long introduction to emphasize its 13th verse, which I think really kind of speaks to our discussion today and Mr. Siddiqui's great book. It is one of the most famous verses in the Quran, and it speaks directly to the work and life of our guest and this discussion and to multiculturalism, if I can say it quickly in Arabic. أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعرفوا. It simply goes on from there, of course. It says, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female and made you into nations and clans that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. I wanted to emphasize this because it, of course, is a verse in also non-complicated Arabic even that is really something that is internalized by the majority of Muslims, even if you're not religiously devout. And this verse, of course, is not surprisingly understood by Muslims the world over as establishing equality with regards to color, race, or origin, basically against kind of discrimination. Only God in this verse can determine one's nobility, and that is based on piety, not based on national origin, race, and even gender. The notion that Islam does not have at its foundational tenets, this notion of multiculturalism is false. The representation of Islamophobia, the nonviolent aspects of it that speaks about Islam as exclusivist, as somehow discriminatory, as deeply and kind of uniquely patriarchal, is really contradicted by one of the most important tenets and foundations of the Islamic law and tradition. And I wanted those who are unfamiliar with Islam and its culture and tradition to remember that verse. And when someone comes to you and says, but Islam is this or like that, you can recall this particular passage and remind them that this is the kind of verse that we learn from childhood. And I think that I wanted to give the dignity and honor to the wonderful work, the life, and the pioneering and courageous work that you've done for Canada, but also for Muslims, and we really appreciate that. That's my concluding remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. And I have my own concluding remarks, but that will be very short, I swear, because we have refreshment and food that will be available just out there, and also copies of the book. And, well, we also, of course, because Haroon is here, you might be lucky enough to also get a signed copy, maybe, if you ask politely, right? So the copies of My Name Is Not Harry are available for sale outside of this room. It's with Paragraph, and we have a good relationship, of course, with them. A wonderful bookstore located very close to our campus here. So, of course, thank you very much, Haroon, for your words. For answering the questions, the many questions from the audience, and also my questions. It was very insightful. I thank you, the MISC team, the team at, of course, also your institute, and you, Khalid, and the people who took the time to come here today. For this event. And I want to tell you a few more things before we can have the actual reception about our forthcoming events here at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. On January 29th, we have Ben Forrest from the Department of Geography, who's also the Director of Canadian Studies, the Canadian Studies program this year. He will give a brown bag talk on density and partisanship, multi-electoral patterns in Canada. And you can find information about this talk and all the others on our website at mcgill.ca/MISC. We also have a panel on February 7th for Black History Month. And we talked about racism earlier today, so it's and the politics of race. And this is actually a roundtable about historical approaches to Black studies with professors David Austin, Sarah Riley-Case, and Wendell Adjeti. And also, I want to tell you that's the last announcement, but that's the most important one, perhaps, is that on April 8th, we'll have first installment of our new conversation series. And this is a scoop because we haven't even issued the press release about this, but there will be some big names and really also will be featured on the program Ideas with Nala Hayed on the CBC later this year. So stay tuned and sign up for our mailing list. We have a sign-up sheet outside as well so that you can be in touch with us and we can really keep you up to date about our forthcoming events. Again, thank you again very much for all of you for and also I hope that you will stick around for the reception. Merci beaucoup. Take care. And buy the book.